She stood on the auction platform with chains cutting into her wrists, just another broken prisoner of war sold to the highest bidder. But when King Roderick's eyes met hers, something impossible happened. His face went white, his hands started shaking, and he paid a fortune that could feed a kingdom for a year, for a girl whose name he shouldn't know, whose face he shouldn't recognize, whose very existence was supposed to be impossible. Because 20 years ago, Princess Celine of Valcrest vanished during a raid that left her presumed dead. Her father, the enemy king, had mourned her. Her kingdom had forgotten her, and someone had made absolutely certain she would never remember who she truly was. They poisoned her mind, stole her memories, and turned a princess into a ghost who didn't even know she was supposed to be dead. Now, in the castle of her father's greatest rival, fragments of a stolen childhood are beginning to surface. A birthmark that matches royal records, dreams of a life she can't quite grasp, and the terrifying realization that whoever tried to erase her 20 years ago is still out there, still watching, and will stop at nothing to finish what they started. Because the lost princess isn't just alive, she's remembering. And some secrets are worth killing for, again and again, until they stay buried forever. The iron chains bit into her wrists with a coldness that had long stopped registering as pain. Celine stood barefoot on the auction platform, her toes curling against wooden planks still damp with the morning's rain, and felt nothing, absolutely nothing. Around her, voices bartered for human flesh with the same casual tone men used when haggling over livestock, and somewhere deep in the cavern of her chest, where a heart should hammer with fear or rage or anything at all, there existed only a vast and terrible silence. She had learned not to remember. The physicians in the war camps had told her this was mercy, this blankness where her childhood should have lived. But standing here now, displayed like spoiled meat before nobles who wrinkled their noses at her matted hair and hollow cheeks, Celine wondered if mercy was supposed to feel like drowning on dry land. The auctioneer's spittle flecked her cheek as he yanked her forward by the chain. Her body moved, obedient as a puppet, but inside her skull something writhed, a pressure building, a wrongness she couldn't name. The crowd of potential buyers blurred into a mass of, velvet and jewels and bored, cruel faces, all except one, a man standing apart from the others, neither pushing forward with greedy hands nor retreating with disgust. He simply watched her with an expression that made her skin prickle, as though he were trying to solve a riddle written in a language he'd forgotten how to read. King Roderick of Ashenmore had not intended to attend the prisoner auction. The very concept nauseated him. This parade of broken souls sold to the highest bidder, but his advisors had insisted. Show strength, they said. Remind the people that Valcrest's armies had failed, that their soldiers now served Ashenmore's tables and fields. Political theater dressed in the stench of unwashed bodies and desperation. But then he saw her. Something in his chest constricted violently, as though an invisible fist had reached through his ribs and squeezed. The girl, no, the young woman, couldn't have been more than 20 years, stood with a peculiar stillness that separated her from the other prisoners. They wept or raged or went limp with resignation. She did none of these things. She simply existed, her gray eyes fixed on some point beyond the crowd, beyond the castle walls, beyond perhaps this world entirely. Those eyes. Roderick's breath caught. The shape of them, the unusual pale gray that seemed to shift between silver and smoke, depending on the light. 50 silver crowns, he heard himself say, his voice cutting through the auctioneer's droning pitch like a blade through silk. The crowd turned, surprise rippling through the gathering. Kings did not personally purchase war prisoners. They had servants for such tasks. The auctioneer's eyes widened with opportunistic glee. Your Majesty honors us with his presence. Surely such royal interest merits a higher starting bid. 100 gold sovereigns. Roderick's words fell like stones into still water. Final offer. Accept it now or I walk away and you sell her for copper pennies to some merchant. We'll work her to death in a brothel. The auctioneer's mouth opened and closed. 100 gold sovereigns could feed a village for a year. For a single prisoner, A girl who looked half dead already. It was insanity. But the king's face permitted no negotiation. "So sold, your majesty. She's yours." Celine felt hands unlock her chains, felt new ones being fastened, lighter but still confining. She was being moved, led away from the platform toward a carriage bearing a crimson and gold crest. She didn't recognize. The king walked beside her, not touching her, maintaining a careful distance that somehow felt more intimate than if he'd grabbed her arm. He smelled of leather and something else, something that made her head swim. Rosemary. No, not quite. The scent triggered a sensation behind her eyes, sharp and sudden like a nail being driven into wood. Pain lanced through her skull. Celine stumbled, would have fallen if the guard holding her new chain hadn't caught her roughly. But in that split second of agony, something flickered. An image, there and gone so fast she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. A garden. Sunlight through leaves. A man's laugh, warm and deep. The same scent of almost rosemary filling her lungs while small hands, her hands, reached toward nothing. The memory, if that's what it was, evaporated like morning mist. "Careful with her!" Roderick's voice was sharp, directed at the guard. "She's under my personal protection now. Any harm that comes to her, I'll take from your hide." The guard paled and immediately loosened his grip. Celine lifted her eyes to the king, studying him properly for the first time. He was perhaps 40 years, with dark hair silvering at the temples and a face carved by either war or worry into hard, handsome lines. But it was his eyes that arrested her. Brown, deep and haunted, holding secrets that seemed to press against the boundaries of his skin, desperate to escape. "Can you speak?" he asked quietly. And there was something in his tone that made her throat tighten inexplicably. "Yes." Her voice emerged rusty, unused. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had cared whether she could speak or not. "What's your name?" "Celine." The name felt both right and wrong in her mouth, like a shoe that almost fit but pinched in strange places. Roderick's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He nodded once, then turned toward the carriage. "You'll ride with me back to the castle. We have much to discuss." But, they didn't discuss anything. The entire journey passed in loaded silence, Roderick staring out one window while Celine stared out the other, both of them trapped in their separate agonies. She could feel his gaze on her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, could sense questions piling up behind his teeth, none of them finding their way into the air between them. The castle of Ashenmoor rose against the gray sky like a promise or a threat. Celine couldn't decide which. Its towers pierced the clouds, its walls thick enough to withstand sieges that had lasted years. As they passed through the gates, servants stopped their work to stare. Whispers followed in their wake like smoke. The king bought a prisoner himself. Personally. Why would he do such a thing? Celine was led not to the servants' quarters, as she'd expected, but to a room in the castle's residential wing. Small but clean, with a real bed, a window overlooking the gardens, and a door that, when closed behind her, had no lock on the outside. She stood in the center of the room, afraid to touch anything, afraid that touching would make it real and real things could be taken away. A knock came at the door. She didn't answer, didn't move. It opened anyway. Roderick entered, alone this time, carrying something folded in his arms. Clean clothes. He set them on the bed, his movements careful, deliberate. "There's a bath being drawn for you down the hall. Fresh water, hot. Soap that doesn't smell like lye. Take your, time." He paused at the door, his hand on the frame, and for a moment she thought he might say something else. Instead, he simply looked at her, with an expression that made something crack inside her chest, some frozen thing beginning to thaw in a way that hurt worse than the cold ever had. "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Why would you pay so much for me?" Roderick's face did something complicated, a series of micro-expressions that flashed too quickly to read. Pain. Guilt. Something that looked almost like grief. "Because," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, You remind me of someone I failed a long time ago, and I won't make that mistake twice." He left before she could ask what he meant. Céline stood alone in the room, her reflection catching in a small mirror on the wall. She barely recognized herself. Hollow cheeks, tangled dark hair, eyes that belonged to someone much older than 20 years. But as she stared, that pressure in her skull returned, stronger now, insistent. Those eyes. Where had she seen eyes like that before? In whose face had she seen that particular shade of gray, that exact pattern of silver flecks around the iris? The answer danced just beyond her reach, a shadow at the edge of consciousness. And for the first time since she could remember, Céline felt something other than nothing. She felt afraid, because some part of her, some deep and primal instinct, understood that remembering might be the most dangerous thing she could possibly do. In his private chambers, Roderick stood before the portrait he kept hidden behind a curtain. A painting 20 years old, commissioned by the enemy king before the war had consumed everything. In it, a young girl no more than 3 years smiled with gap-toothed joy, her small hand clasped in her father's, and her eyes, pale gray with silver flecks, stared out from the canvas with an innocence that made Roderick's hands shake as he finally allowed himself to speak the truth aloud into the empty room. "God forgive me. I know exactly who you are." The hot water should have been a blessing, but Céline found herself frozen at the edge of the copper tub, her fingers trembling above the steam that rose like ghosts into the dimly lit bathing chamber. The serving woman who'd prepared the bath had left her alone, perhaps sensing that this act of basic human dignity required privacy after months of having none. But now, confronted with the simple task of removing her filthy rags and stepping into clean water, Céline discovered her body had forgotten how to perform such ordinary rituals. Her hands moved to the ties of her torn dress, and that's when the trembling became shaking, violent, and uncontrollable. The fabric fell away, and she caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror positioned near the dressing screen. Ribs pressing against skin like prison bars, bruises in various stages of healing, painting her flesh in shades of yellow and purple, and green. But it wasn't the evidence of physical suffering that made her breath catch in her throat. It was the mark on her left shoulder blade. A birthmark, roughly the size of a silver coin, shaped like a crescent moon with 3 small dots clustered at one tip. She'd seen it before in her fragmented reflections in dirty puddles and broken glass, but had never given it any particular thought. Now, staring at it in the clear mirror, something about its shape made her skull feel too tight, as though her brain were swelling against bone, trying to break free. She knew this mark. Somehow, impossibly, she knew it meant something. The water accepted her body with a sigh, and Céline submerged herself completely, holding her breath beneath the surface until her lungs screamed. When she emerged, gasping, tears were streaming down her face, though she couldn't say why. The soap smelled of lavender and something citrus, and with each pass of the cloth against her skin, she felt layers being stripped away. Not just dirt, but something deeper. The numbness that had protected her was dissolving, leaving raw nerves exposed to air that felt suddenly too sharp, too real. A knock at the door made her heart lurch. "Miss Céline?" A woman's voice, older, gentle. "I've brought fresh linens and a meal. May I enter?" "Yes." The word came out small, childlike. The woman who entered had gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had seen too much to be shocked by anything. She sat down, her bundle, and studied Céline with an expression that wasn't pity, but something closer to recognition. "I'm Marta, the head housekeeper. His Majesty has asked me to attend to your needs personally." She paused, her gaze lingering on Céline's face with an intensity that made the girl want to sink back beneath the water. "You have her eyes." "Whose eyes?" The question emerged before Céline could stop it, desperate and raw. Marta's face shuddered immediately, as though a curtain had been drawn. "Forgive me, an old woman's rambling. Let's get you dried and dressed before the food grows cold." But the moment had cracked something open. Céline stood from the bath, accepting the linen towel Marta offered, and felt the housekeeper's sharp intake of breath. What is it?" "The mark on your shoulder." Marta's voice had gone strange, thin and tight. "Where did you get it?" "I've always had it. It's a birthmark." "Yes." Marta's hands trembled as she helped Celine into a simple gray dress. Soft wool that felt like luxury against skin accustomed to burlap and chains. "Yes, of course it is." The meal waiting in Celine's chamber consisted of bread still warm from the oven, roasted chicken that fell from the bone at the touch of a fork, vegetables glazed in butter and herbs, and a small bowl of berries that gleamed like jewels. Celine sat before it, stomach growling with hunger, but found her hands wouldn't cooperate. The abundance paralyzed her. In the camps, you ate what you could. Steal as fast as you could swallow before someone stronger took it from you. This careful arrangement on porcelain plates with actual silverware belonged to a world she couldn't remember knowing. "Start slow." Marta's voice held unexpected kindness. "Your stomach's forgotten rich food. Small bites, or you'll be sick." Celine obeyed, tearing off a piece of bread and letting it melt on her tongue. The taste exploded across her senses with such intensity that she gasped. And with that gasp came another flash, bright and sharp as lightning. A different meal, a different table. A man's voice saying, "Slow down, little star, the food won't run away." Laughter, warmth, the sensation of being safe, of being loved, of being... The memory shattered. Celine dropped the bread, pressing her palms against her temples where pain bloomed like dark flowers. "What's happening to me?" "I'll fetch the physician," Marta said quickly, moving toward the door. "No." Celine's voice came out harder than intended. "No physicians, please. They gave me things before, medicines that made the empty feeling worse. I just need..." She didn't know what she needed. Air, space, answers to questions she couldn't even properly form. Marta hesitated at the threshold, her weathered face creased with an internal struggle. Finally, she spoke, her words careful as footsteps across ice. "His Majesty has requested your presence at dinner this evening, in his private dining chamber, not the Great Hall. He wishes to speak with you." "About what?" "That's not for me to say." But Marta's eyes said volumes. Whatever Roderick wanted to discuss, it was nothing simple, nothing safe. The hours until evening crawled by with agonizing slowness. Celine tried to eat more but managed only a few bites before nausea overwhelmed her. She tried to sleep but found herself staring at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the plaster that seemed to form patterns, symbols, a language she almost understood. The light changed from gray afternoon to amber dusk, and with each shift of shadow across her floor, the pressure in her skull intensified. When Marta returned to escort her to dinner, Celine barely recognized herself in the mirror. The clean dress, the brushed hair falling in dark waves past her shoulders, the face slowly emerging from beneath layers of grime, revealed features that seemed simultaneously familiar and foreign. High cheekbones, a straight nose with a slight upturn at the end. Lips that might have been full before starvation had thinned them. And those eyes. Always those eyes that stared back at her like accusers. The walk through the castle's corridors felt like a descent into another realm. Servants averted their gazes as she passed, but she caught their whispered words trailing in her wake. "Who is she? Why would the king buy a prisoner? Did you see the way he looked at her? It's indecent. It's dangerous." Roderick's private dining chamber was smaller than she'd imagined, almost intimate, with a fireplace crackling against the evening chill and a table set for two. The king stood at the window, his back to the door, shoulders tense beneath his dark velvet jacket. He didn't turn when she entered, didn't acknowledge her presence for a long moment that stretched taut as a bowstring. "Do you remember anything from before the camps?" His question cut through the silence like a knife through flesh. "Anything at all?" Celine's throat constricted. "No. The physician said I suffered a fever, that it burned away my memories like fire through parchment." "Physicians?" Roderick's voice dripped with something dark and bitter. "How convenient." He finally turned to face her, and the expression on his face made her step backward involuntarily. It wasn't anger precisely, though anger lived somewhere in the tightness of his jaw. It was grief, vast and terrible, mixed with something that looked almost like guilt. "Sit, please. We have much to discuss, and all of it will be difficult to hear." She sat because her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. Roderick took the chair opposite but didn't touch the food laid out between them. Instead, he reached into his jacket and withdrew something small, wrapped in dark cloth. He placed it on the table between them, his hand lingering over it as though reluctant to let go. "Before I show you this," he said slowly, each word weighted with care, "I need you to understand something. There are people who want you dead. People who believed you already were dead. Bringing you here, revealing what I know, puts you in danger I'm not certain I can protect you from." Fear, sharp and cold, sliced through Céline's chest. "I don't understand. I'm nobody. A prisoner. Why would anyone care if I live or die?" "Because you're not nobody." Roderick's hands were shaking as he unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small portrait no larger than his palm. He slid it across the table toward her. "You're someone very, very important. And the people who tried to erase you will stop at nothing to finish what they started." Céline's fingers closed around the portrait's frame. She lifted it, angling it toward the firelight, and her world tilted violently on its axis. The painting showed a young girl, perhaps 3 years old, with dark hair and pale gray eyes flecked with silver. She wore a velvet dress and a smile of pure, uncomplicated joy, and in her small hand she clutched a wooden toy carved in the shape of a horse. The room spun. Céline's vision tunneled, darkness creeping in from the edges, because she knew that toy. Somewhere in the vast emptiness of her stolen memories, she knew its weight in her palm, knew the smoothness of wood worn soft by small fingers, knew the name she'd given it, though the word dissolved before reaching her tongue. "Who is this?" Her voice emerged strangled, barely human. Roderick leaned forward, his eyes burning with intensity that pinned her in place. "That's Princess Céline Thorne of Valcrest, daughter of King Edmund, heir to the throne. She disappeared 20 years ago during a raid on the Summer Palace. Everyone assumed she'd been killed." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked like breaking glass. "But she wasn't killed. She was taken, hidden, and someone made very certain she would never remember who she truly was." The portrait slipped from Céline's numb fingers, clattering against the table. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. "Princess, daughter, heir." The words ricocheted inside her skull, each one a hammer blow against the walls she'd built around the emptiness. And with each blow, those walls began to crack. The word princess sat in Céline's mouth like a stone, heavy and foreign, choking off any possibility of speech. She stared at the portrait on the table, at the smiling child who was supposedly her, and felt her mind fracture into 1,000 contradictory pieces. Each piece screamed a different truth. Liar, mistake, impossible. But beneath the cacophony of denial, something deeper stirred, something that recognized the shape of that little girl's joy as an echo of something she'd lost. "You're wrong." The words tore from her throat, ragged and desperate. "I'm nobody. I've always been nobody. The camps, the other prisoners, they all said I was found wandering near a burned village, that my parents were rebels who... They lied." Roderick's voice cut through her spiral with surgical precision. "Or they were told lies." "Céline, look at me." He waited until her wild eyes met his. "I knew your father. Before the war consumed everything between our kingdoms, Edmund and I were not enemies. We were friends. I attended your naming ceremony when you were 3 days old. I held you in my arms while your father boasted about how you'd grabbed my finger and wouldn't let go." His voice cracked, raw with emotion he could no longer contain. "I watched him weep when you vanished. I watched it destroy him, turn him from a man of reason into someone who would burn the world to ash if he thought it would bring you back." Céline's hands clutched at the edge of the table, knuckles white with the effort of holding herself together. "Then why doesn't he know I'm alive? Why hasn't anyone come for me? Because whoever took you made certain no one would look. They staged your death so convincingly that even Edmund accepted it after years of fruitless searching. Roderick stood abruptly, pacing to the fireplace, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark omen. The raid on the Summer Palace was meticulously planned, not by foreign enemies, but by someone close. Someone who knew exactly when the guards would change, which routes the royal family would take to escape, where the princess would be sleeping. You're saying someone from my own kingdom took me? The horror in her voice made it shake. Why? What could possibly be worth? Succession. The word fell between them like an executioner's blade. Edmund had no sons. You were his only legitimate heir, but he had a brother, your uncle, Lord Garrett Thorne, who believed the throne should pass through male lines. He had his own son, your cousin Marcus, who he'd been grooming to rule since birth. Roderick turned back to face her, and in the firelight his features looked carved from stone. If you died, Marcus would become heir. The crown would pass from Edmund to Garrett, then to Marcus. A neat, clean line of succession. Celine's stomach churned violently. She pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. You think my own family tried to kill me? I think your uncle paid people to make you disappear. Whether he intended for you to die or simply vanish forever doesn't matter. The result was the same. Roderick's jaw tightened. What those people didn't anticipate was that you'd survive. That somehow, despite their best efforts to erase every trace of who you were, something in you refused to be completely destroyed. The room tilted again. Celine gripped the table harder, her nails digging into the wood. Images flashed behind her eyes, disjointed and painful. A man's face, features blurred but emanating warmth. Large hands lifting her high into the air while she shrieked with laughter. A woman's voice singing something soft and sad. And then darkness, sudden and complete, swallowing everything. The physicians who treated you in the camps, Roderick continued, his voice gentler now, as though he sensed how close she was to shattering entirely. Did they give you anything? Medicines, tonics, something you had to take regularly? Celine's brow furrowed, concentration cutting through the chaos. Yes, a bitter tea. They said it was for the fever, to keep it from returning. I had to drink it every morning. Her eyes widened as understanding dawned, cold and terrible. It wasn't medicine, was it? I believe it was poison. Not enough to kill you, but enough to keep your memories suppressed, to ensure that even if someone found you, even if you somehow ended up in a position where questions might be asked, you'd have no answers to give. Roderick's hands clenched into fists at his sides. They turned you into a ghost, Celine. A living ghost who couldn't haunt them because you didn't even know you were dead. Tears streamed down her face now, hot and unstoppable. She wasn't crying for the childhood she couldn't remember, or even for the parents she'd been stolen from. She was crying for the emptiness, for the years of feeling like a hollow shell pretending to be human, for the bone-deep certainty that something essential had been carved out of her, and she'd never even known what she was missing. Why are you telling me this? Her voice emerged broken, a shattered thing, barely holding its shape. Why would you risk bringing me here, revealing what you know, if these people are as dangerous as you say? Because I owe your father a debt I can never repay. Roderick's confession hit the air like a physical force. The raid that took you happened because of intelligence I provided. Not intentionally, I swear on my life, but I mentioned in a diplomatic letter that the royal family would be summering at the coastal palace. I thought nothing of it, simple court correspondence between allied kingdoms. But someone intercepted that letter. Someone used my words to plan your abduction. He crossed the space between them, dropping to one knee beside her chair so their eyes were level. For 20 years I've lived with that guilt. Every time I saw Edmund's face, every time he spoke of you with that hollow voice people use for the dead, I died a little more inside. I can't give you back those lost years, but I can give you the truth, and I can keep you alive long enough to decide what you want to do with it. Celine stared into his eyes, searching for deception and finding only naked honesty that hurt to witness. What if I don't want this truth? What if I'd rather stay empty than remember whatever horrors made me this way? Then I'll respect that choice. Roderick's hand moved as though to touch hers, then stopped, hovering in the space between comfort and propriety. But you deserve to know what was taken from you before you decide whether to reclaim it. A knock at the door shattered the moment's intimacy. Both of them jerked back, Roderick rising swiftly as Marta entered without waiting for permission, her face pale with urgency. Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but Lord Chancellor Hayes has arrived with urgent news from the border. He insists on seeing you immediately. Something flickered across Roderick's face, there and gone too quickly to name. Tell him I'll attend him shortly. He's most insistent, Your Majesty. He says it concerns King Edmund. Celine's head snapped up at her father's name, though she still couldn't bring herself to think of him as father with any conviction. Roderick's jaw tightened, his gaze cutting between her and Marta in a silent calculation. Finally, he nodded. I'll come now. He turned to Celine, lowering his voice. Stay in this room. Don't leave. Don't speak to anyone until I return. Do you understand? She nodded, though fear had wrapped its cold fingers around her throat. Is something wrong? I don't know yet. He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back with an expression that made her breath catch. But Celine, if I'm right about who's been hunting you all these years, they have eyes. Everywhere. Even here. Trust no one except Marta until I tell you otherwise. The door closed behind him with a sound like a tomb sealing shut. Celine sat alone in the flickering firelight, the portrait of her younger self still lying on the table like an accusation. She picked it up with trembling hands, studying the little girl's face, searching for herself in those features and finding only questions. The toy horse the child held in the portrait caught her attention, and Celine's breath itched. She knew that toy. The knowledge blazed through her with such certainty that it hurt. Nightwind. She'd called it Nightwind because its carved mane looked like it was flying in a storm. The memory surfaced like a body rising from deep water, and with it came others, fragmentary and painful. Running through a garden, the toy clutched to her chest. A woman's scream, cut off too abruptly. Men in dark clothes, faces covered. Being lifted roughly, a hand clamped over her mouth. The taste of something bitter forced down her throat, and then nothing. A void so complete it had its own gravity, pulling everything into darkness. Celine doubled over in the chair, a sob tearing from her chest. The memories were returning, not in a gentle stream but in violent waves that threatened to drown her. And somewhere in the castle she could hear raised voices, doors slamming, the sound of boots running through corridors with military urgency. Something was happening. Something that made her newly awakened instincts scream with warning. Marta appeared in the doorway again, her face now ghost white, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to still them. Miss Celine, you need to come with me. Now. The king said to stay. The king doesn't know what I know. Marta's voice dropped to a whisper so low Celine had to lean forward to hear it. There's a man in the castle who shouldn't be here. A man I recognize from Valcrest, from the old court. One of your Uncle Garrett's personal guards. Her eyes shone with tears. They've found you. And this time, they won't make the mistake of letting you live. Terror crystallized in Celine's veins, turning her blood to ice. She stood frozen, every instinct screaming contradictory commands. Run, hide, fight, trust no one. Trust this woman whose eyes held 20 years of guilty secrets. The choice paralyzed her until Marta's hand closed around her wrist with surprising strength for someone so aged, yanking her toward a tapestry that covered the western wall. There's a servant's passage behind this, Marta hissed, her fingers working at something hidden in the wall's decorative molding. It leads to the lower kitchens and from there to the old wine cellars. No one uses them anymore except rats, and a soft click interrupted her, and the tapestry swung outward, revealing a narrow corridor that smelled of dust and decay. Move. Now. Celine stumbled into the darkness, her shoulder scraping against rough stone. Behind her, she heard Marta replace the tapestry, plunging them into absolute blackness, broken only by the thin strip of light that leaked through the edges of the hidden door. The older woman's breathing came harsh and ragged, and Céline realized with a start that Marta was crying, quiet tears that spoke of guilt held too long. "You knew." Céline's accusation barely rose above a whisper, but in the confined space it might as well have been a shout. "All this time, you knew who I was. I suspected." Marta's voice wavered like a candle flame in wind. "The moment I saw your face in the bathing chamber, saw that mark on your shoulder, I knew. I was there the day you were born. I helped the midwife clean you, watched your mother count your fingers and toes while your father paced outside the door like a caged animal." A sob broke through her careful control. "I was there the night you were taken too. I heard the screams, saw the smoke, found your toy horse lying in the garden with blood on its mane." The revelation hit Céline like a physical blow. "Then why didn't you say something? Why didn't you tell Roderick immediately?" "Because I was afraid." The words exploded from Marta with the force of 2 decades suppressed anguish. "Don't you understand? I was the one who opened the garden gate that night. One of the raiders told me they were guards sent by your uncle to escort the family to safety, showed me forged documents with Garrett's seal. I believed them. God help me. I believed them and I let them through." Her hand found Céline's in the darkness, gripping with desperate intensity. "I've lived with that mistake every day since. When I fled Valcrest after the raid, when I took service here in Ashenmoor, I swore I'd spend my remaining years in penance. And then you appeared, like a ghost returned to haunt me for my sins." Céline wanted to pull away, wanted to rage at this woman whose naivety had cost her everything. But beneath the anger, something else stirred. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of shared trauma. They were both victims of the same conspiracy, both hollowed out by choices made in darkness by people who valued power over life. "Does Roderick know about your part in it?" "No. And if we survive this night, you can tell him everything. Let him execute me if that's what justice demands." Marta's voice steadied, taking on the crisp efficiency of someone who'd made peace with their fate. "But first we need to get you somewhere. Safe. Come. Stay close and stay silent." They moved through the passage like shadows, Marta's hand on Céline's elbow guiding her around obstacles invisible in the darkness. The air grew colder as they descended, and Céline could hear water dripping somewhere distant, each drop echoing like a countdown. Behind them, muffled by stone and distance, came the sound of shouting. Men's voices raised in anger or alarm, she couldn't tell which. The passage opened into a larger space that Marta identified. In a whisper as the lower kitchens, long abandoned after a fire had damaged the ovens beyond repair. Moonlight filtered through gaps in boarded windows, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Céline could make out the shapes of old work tables, pots hanging from ceiling hooks like the corpses of executed criminals, and something else that made her heart stutter. A figure stood near the far door, perfectly still, watching them with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Marta saw him. The same instant and went rigid, her hand tightening painfully on Céline's arm. "Run," she breathed. "Run and don't look back." But Céline's legs had turned to stone, because as the figure stepped into a shaft of moonlight, she saw his face clearly. A man perhaps 40 years old, with features that might have been handsome if not for the coldness that lived behind his eyes. And those eyes, pale blue and calculating, fixed on her with an expression that mingled triumph and something darker. Recognition. "Princess Céline." His voice carried the cultured accent of Valcrest nobility, each syllable precisely enunciated. "Or should I call you the little ghost? I must confess, when word reached us that King Roderick had purchased a Valcrest prisoner at auction, I hardly dared hope. But then I saw you myself at dinner, glimpsed through a doorway, and there was no mistaking those eyes. Your father's eyes, the eyes that should have closed forever 20 years ago. Who are you?" Céline forced the words past the terror that threatened to choke her. "Sir Edmund Voss, though I served under a different name in your uncle's household. Lord Garrett sends his regards, by the way. He's grown quite anxious in recent months, ever since rumors began circulating about a girl in the war camps who bore an uncanny resemblance to the lost princess. Voss began walking toward them with the unhurried confidence of a predator who knows its prey cannot escape. He tasked me with investigating these rumors, and here you are, delivered into my hands by fate's peculiar sense of humor. Marta stepped in front of Céline, her aged body forming a barrier between the girl and this man who radiated menace. You'll have to go through me first. Oh, I intend to. Voss's hand went to his belt, where a blade glinted dully in the moonlight. You were always troublesome, Marta. Garrett suspected you knew more than you admitted about that night. This saves me the trouble of hunting you down. Separately, everything happened in the space between heartbeats. Voss lunged forward with practiced efficiency. Marta shoved Céline backward with surprising strength, sending her sprawling against an overturned table. The blade flashed silver in the moonlight, and Marta's scream cut through the darkness like broken glass. No! Céline's voice tore from her throat, raw and animalistic. She scrambled to her feet, searching desperately for something, anything to use as a weapon. Her hand closed around a cast-iron pan hanging from a hook, its weight familiar in a way that bypassed conscious thought. Without thinking, operating on instinct alone, she swung it with all her strength at Voss's head. The impact sent shockwaves up her arms. Voss staggered, blood streaming from a gash above his temple, his blade clattering to the floor. For a moment, Céline thought she'd won, that this nightmare would end here. But then Voss's hand shot out, catching her wrist with bruising force, yanking her toward him. His breath, hot and sour, washed over her face. You should have stayed dead, little princess, he snarled, his free hand closing around her throat. This time, I'll make certain there's no mistake. Pressure built in Céline's head as his fingers tightened, cutting off air, cutting off light, cutting off everything. Her vision tunneled, darkness creeping in from the edges. But in that darkness, something else awakened. A memory, sharp and clear as broken glass. A voice, her father's. Voice, teaching her something important. If someone bigger attacks you, don't fight their strength. Find their weakness. Her hand, still clutching the pan, swung upward with the last of her fading strength, connecting with Voss's ribs in the spot her father had once shown her on a diagram. The vulnerable place where bone and organ met. Voss's grip loosened as he doubled over with a grunt of agony, and Céline tore herself free, gasping for air that burned like fire in her abused throat. She stumbled toward Marta, who lay crumpled against the far wall, her hand pressed to her side where blood seeped between her fingers. Can you walk? Go. Marta's voice emerged wet and bubbling. Get to the wine cellars. There's a tunnel, leads outside the castle walls. Follow it north until you reach the old mill. Hide there until dawn. I'm not leaving you. You are. Marta's eyes, clouded with pain, nonetheless burned with fierce determination. I spent 20 years running from what I did. Let me spend my last moments making it right. She pushed something into Céline's hand, a small key on a leather cord. The mill, under the floorboards in the northwest corner. Documents I kept, insurance against the day Garrett might come for me. Everything you need to prove who you are. Behind them, Voss was recovering, pushing himself upright with murder written across his bloodied face. Céline looked between him and Marta, her heart tearing in two directions. Every instinct screamed at her. To flee, but something deeper, something that might have been emerging memory or simple human decency, refused to abandon this woman who'd just saved her life. The decision was made for her when the door behind Voss burst open, revealing Roderick with 6 guards, all armed, all taking in the scene with expressions that shifted from confusion to horror to rage in rapid succession. Seize him! Roderick's command cracked like a whip. The guards moved as one, surrounding Voss before he could reach his fallen blade. But Roderick's eyes were on Céline, scanning her for injuries with barely contained desperation. Are you hurt? She shook her head, unable to speak, her throat still burning from Voss's grip. Instead, she pointed to Marta, whose hand had fallen away from her side, revealing a wound that looked far worse in the fuller light from the guards' torches. Roderick knelt beside the housekeeper, his face going pale. "Get the physician! Now!" One guard sprinted away while the others held. Voss, who'd gone eerily still, his eyes fixed on Céline with an expression that promised this wasn't over. "Tell Edmund," Marta whispered, her words directed at Roderick but her eyes on Céline. "Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him she survived. Tell him his daughter is every bit as fierce as he always believed she'd be." "You'll tell him yourself," Roderick said, but his voice lacked conviction. Marta smiled, sad and knowing. "We both know better, Your Majesty." Her hand found Céline's, pressing the key deeper into her palm. "Remember, the mill. Don't trust anyone until you have proof." And then her eyes closed, her chest going still, and the woman who'd spent 20 years drowning in guilt finally found the peace that only death could offer. The physician arrived too late, his bag of instruments and remedies rendered meaningless by the finality of death. Céline sat on the cold stone floor beside Marta's body, her hand still clutching the older woman's cooling fingers, and felt something. Fundamental shift inside her. The numbness that had protected her for so long was gone, burned away by violence and revelation, leaving only raw grief that felt like swallowing glass. Roderick stood nearby, speaking in low, urgent tones with his captain of the guard. Voss had been dragged away to the dungeons, his protests of diplomatic immunity falling on ears made deaf by the evidence of attempted murder. But Céline heard none of it. Her entire world had contracted to the weathered face of the woman who'd died protecting her, the woman who'd carried the weight of one mistake for 2 decades until it crushed her. "Céline." Roderick's voice pulled her back from the edge of whatever dark place she'd been sliding toward. He knelt beside her, his hand hovering near her shoulder but not quite touching, as though afraid she might shatter at contact. "We need to move her. The servants are already whispering, and word will spread quickly. By morning, half the castle will know something happened. Here tonight. Let them know." Céline's voice emerged flat, emotionless, a perfect mirror of how she'd sounded in the camps. "Let everyone know that my uncle's assassin murdered a defenseless old woman because she tried to protect me. It's not that simple." Roderick's jaw tightened with frustration. Voss came here as part of a diplomatic envoy from Valcrest. Technically, he has protections under the treaty between our kingdoms. If I execute him without proper cause... Proper cause? The words exploded from Céline with volcanic force, shattering her hollow calm. "He just tried to kill me. You saw him. Your guards saw him. There's a dead woman at our feet because of him. And you're worried about diplomatic protocols? I'm worried about keeping you alive." Roderick's composure cracked, revealing the fear beneath. "If I move against Voss too openly, too quickly, it confirms everything. It tells Garrett that we know who you are, that you've recovered enough memory to be dangerous. Right. Now, we have a small advantage. He thinks Voss acted alone, thinks this situation is contained. The moment that changes, your uncle will have no choice but to move against you with everything he has." The logic was sound, but it tasted like poison in Céline's mouth. She wanted justice, immediate and violent. She wanted to watch Voss suffer the way Marta had suffered, the way she'd suffered in those camps while her memories were systematically destroyed. But beneath the rage, a colder part of her mind was awakening. The part that remembered being taught strategy and patience. The part that understood sometimes vengeance required a longer game. "What do we do then?" She finally released Marta's hand, letting it fall gently to rest across the woman's chest. "Pretend this never happened? Let him return to Valcrest and report that the lost princess has been found?" "No." Roderick stood, offering his hand to help her up. "We use him. Make him tell us everything he knows about Garrett's EU network. Who else is involved? How many people in both kingdoms are complicit in keeping you erased?" His expression hardened into something that reminded Céline why this man was king. "And then, when we have what we need, I'll see him hang for what he did to Marta and what he tried to do to you. Treaty be damned." Céline took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. Her legs trembled with exhaustion and shock, but she forced herself to stand straight, to meet his gaze without flinching. "He'll never talk. Men like that, They're loyal to their gold and their masters. Everyone talks eventually. The darkness in Roderick's voice sent chills down her spine, especially when they realize their master has already abandoned them. I received word tonight from my spies in Valcrest. Your Uncle Garrett has been quietly moving troops toward the border, preparing for something. Whether he's planning to invade or simply defend against whatever chaos he expects when your existence becomes known, I can't say. But it tells me he's desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. They left Marta's body in the care of servants who Roderick trusted, women who'd served his household for decades and knew when silence was more valuable than gossip. The walk back through the castle's corridors felt surreal, as though Céline had stepped through a veil into a world that looked identical to the one before, but operated under entirely different rules. Everywhere she looked, she saw potential. Threats. That guard with the slight limp? Was he watching her too closely? The servant girl who averted her eyes too quickly, had she been listening at doors? The very stones of the castle seemed to harbor secrets, whispering in languages she was only beginning to understand. Roderick led her not back to her chamber but to his own private study, a room dominated by maps and books and correspondence stacked in careful piles that suggested a mind constantly at work on a dozen problems. Simultaneously, he poured 2 glasses of wine from a crystal decanter, pressing one into her hands despite her weak protest that she shouldn't drink. You've just killed a man, watched another woman die, and discovered you're the lost heir to a hostile kingdom. You've earned the right to something stronger than water. He downed his own glass in one long swallow, then poured another. Besides, we need to talk about what happens next, and this conversation requires fortification. Céline sipped the wine, feeling it burn a trail down her abused throat. Marta gave me something before she died, a key. She said there are documents hidden at an old mill north of here, proof of who I am. She pulled the key from where she'd tucked it into her dress, the leather cord still warm from contact with her skin. She told me not to trust anyone until I had that proof. Roderick stared at the key with an expression she couldn't quite read. Smart woman. Smarter than I gave her credit for. He moved to one of the maps on his wall, tracing a finger along a route that led from the castle into the surrounding countryside. The old mill. I know it. Been abandoned for at least 15 years, maybe longer. If she hid something there, it survived this long undiscovered. He turned back to face her, and the weight of decision hung heavy in the air between them. We'll go at first light. Small party. People I trust absolutely. Get whatever Marta left for you, then decide our next move. Our next move? Céline set down her glass, the wine suddenly tasting too bitter. What do you mean, our next move? This is my problem. My past. My uncle trying to erase me from existence. You've done enough, Roderick. More than enough. You don't have to. Don't have to what? Help you? His laugh held no humor. Céline, the moment I brought you into this castle, the moment I revealed what I knew, I made this my problem too. Garrett won't stop with you. He'll come after everyone who knows your secret. Everyone who could testify to your identity. That includes me, my household, anyone who's had contact with you since you arrived. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his hands gripping her shoulders with gentle intensity. But even if that weren't true, even if helping you put no one else at risk, I'd still do it. Because 20 years ago I failed to protect you, and I've been living with that failure every single day since. Tears burned behind Céline's eyes, threatening to spill over. It wasn't your fault. The letter you wrote, you couldn't have known. But I should have. I should have questioned why someone would need to know the royal family's summer schedule. I should have been more careful, more suspicious, more something. His voice cracked with the weight of self-recrimination he'd carried for 2 decades. I can't change what happened then, but I can damn well make sure you survive what happens next. The moment stretched between them, intimate and charged with emotions. Neither seemed capable of naming. Céline became acutely aware of his hands on her shoulders, the warmth of his body so close to hers, the way his eyes searched her face as though trying to memorize every detail. Something stirred in her chest, an emotion that had no place in the nightmare her life had become. Not attraction exactly, though she couldn't deny the way her pulse quickened at his proximity. Something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. The sense that this man understood the specific shape of her brokenness because he carried his own shattered pieces that fit against hers in all the wrong and right ways. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Roderick stepped back quickly, professional distance reasserting itself like armor sliding into place. Enter. The captain of the guard, a grizzled man named Werner, whose face bore the scars of a lifetime at war, stepped inside with an expression that made Céline's stomach drop. Your Majesty, we have a situation. The prisoner Voss, he's demanding to see you. Says he has information about an imminent threat to the kingdom, but he'll only share it with you personally. Probably a trick. Roderick's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd heard every manipulation, every desperate ploy from cornered enemies. He wants to gauge how much we know, see if he can negotiate his way out of execution. Perhaps. Werner's hesitation suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. But there's something else. We searched his belongings. Found correspondence hidden in the false bottom of his travel trunk, letters in code mostly, but one was written plainly. From someone in your own court, Your Majesty, warning Garrett that you'd taken unusual interest in a specific prisoner from the recent auction. The room went deathly silent. Céline watched color drain from Roderick's face, replaced by cold fury that made him look suddenly dangerous. Someone in my court is reporting to Garrett, feeding him information about Céline? It appears so. Werner pulled a folded letter from his jacket, extending it toward the king. The signature is unclear, could be interpreted several ways. But the handwriting, it's educated. Someone with access to court information, someone close enough to observe your movements. Roderick took the letter with hands that shook with barely suppressed rage. He read it once, twice, then crumpled it in his fist. When he looked up, his eyes had gone flat and cold, the eyes of a man capable of terrible things when pushed far enough. Double the guard on Céline's door. No one enters her chambers without my explicit permission. And Werner, I want you to personally investigate every member of the court. Everyone. I don't care about rank or how long they've served. Someone betrayed us, and I will find out who. Your Majesty. Werner bowed and withdrew, leaving Céline and Roderick alone again with this new terrible knowledge hanging between them. I'm not safe here. Céline spoke the truth they were both avoiding. Even in your castle, surrounded by guards, I'm not safe. Because the threat isn't just outside these walls. It's inside them, walking the same corridors, eating at the same tables, pretending loyalty while sharpening knives in the shadows. Roderick moved to the window, staring out at the night sky where storm clouds gathered like dark omens. Then we move faster than they expect. We go to the mill tonight, not at first light. Get Marta's evidence while everyone thinks we're sleeping. By the time Garrett's spy realizes you're gone, we'll have everything we need. And then what? Céline joined him at the window, following his gaze to the darkness beyond. What do we do with proof that I'm the lost princess? March into Valcrest and demand my birthright? That's suicide. Garrett has had 20 years to consolidate power, to build alliances, to prepare for the possibility that I might someday return. No. Roderick's reflection in the glass smiled, sharpened, calculating. We do something he'll never expect. We tell your father the truth. The night swallowed them whole as they slipped through the castle's postern gate, a door so small and insignificant that even most servants forgot it existed. Roderick led the way with Werner close behind, while Céline found herself sandwiched between two additional guards, whose names she hadn't caught and faces she could barely see in the moonless dark. They moved in silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on gravel and the occasional hoot of an owl that sounded too much like a warning. Céline's heart hammered against her ribs with such force she was certain everyone could hear it. Every shadow seemed to hold potential assassins, every rustle of wind through trees the whisper of blades being drawn. The key Marta had given her hung around her neck, hidden beneath her borrowed cloak, but its weight felt immense, as though it were made of lead rather than iron. With each step toward the mill, toward Whatever truth lay hidden there, she felt herself moving further from the girl she'd been and closer to someone she wasn't sure she was ready to become. The countryside beyond the castle walls stretched endless and alien. Céline realized with a start that she couldn't remember the last time she'd been outside at night by choice rather than necessity. In the camps, darkness had meant danger, meant hiding from guards who enjoyed their cruelty more when witnesses were scarce. Here, the darkness felt different but no less threatening. It held possibilities both terrible and transformative, and she wasn't certain which frightened her more. The mill is just beyond that ridge. Roderick's whisper barely reached her ears. He'd positioned himself beside her despite Werner's obvious displeasure at the king taking such risks. Another 10 minutes, perhaps less. And if someone's already there, if Garrett's people found Marta's hiding place before we could, then we improvise. His hand found hers in the darkness, a brief squeeze of reassurance that sent warmth flooding through her cold fingers. But I don't think they have. Marta was careful, paranoid even. If she'd been discovered, we would have known long before tonight. They crested the ridge, and the old mill materialized below them like something from a nightmare. 3 stories of rotting wood and crumbling stone, its water wheel long since collapsed into the stream that had once powered it. Windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and the entire structure leaned slightly to one side, as though exhausted by the effort of remaining upright. No lights showed in those broken windows. No smoke rose from the chimney. The place looked abandoned, forgotten, exactly as Marta had intended. But as they drew closer, Céline felt her skin prickle with awareness. Something was wrong. She couldn't name what exactly, couldn't point to any specific detail that screamed danger, but every instinct she'd honed during her time in the camp suddenly howled at her to stop, to turn back, to run. Wait. Her voice cut through the silence like a knife. The entire group froze, hands moving to weapons. Something's not right. Werner's eyes scanned the darkness with the efficiency of a man who'd survived countless ambushes. I don't see anything. Neither do I. That's the problem. Céline pointed toward the mill's entrance, where the door hung slightly ajar. Marta said no one's used this place in years, but that door, it's been opened recently. Look at the ground beneath it. The dirt's been disturbed and there are tracks leading inside. Fresh ones. Roderick studied the area she'd indicated, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern. She's right. Someone's been here, and not long ago. He turned to Werner. Take 2 men and circle around back. If anyone's inside, I want them trapped between us. Your Majesty, with respect, you should let me go in first. No. Roderick's tone allowed no argument. If there are documents inside that prove Céline's identity, I need to see them immediately. We can't risk them being destroyed in whatever confrontation might occur. He drew his sword, the steel whispering against leather as it left its sheath. But I'm not fool enough to walk in undefended. Werner clearly wanted to protest further, but settled for a curt nod. He gestured to 2 guards who melted into the shadows, moving with the silent efficiency of men trained for exactly this type of operation. The remaining guard, a young man whose nervous energy was palpable even in the dark, positioned himself at Roderick's left while Céline found herself pushed slightly behind them both. They approached the mill's entrance with agonizing slowness, each step measured and deliberate. The door's hinges groaned as Roderick pushed it wider, the sound impossibly loud in the nighttime stillness. Inside, darkness pressed thick as wool, broken only by fragments of moonlight that filtered through the broken roof. The smell hit Céline immediately, damp wood and rot and something else, something metallic and wrong. Blood. Fresh blood. Stay behind me. Roderick's command came too late. Céline had already seen what the moonlight revealed in the corner of the mill's main room. A body, crumpled and still, dark liquid pooling beneath it in a spreading stain. Not just any body. The uniform, even in the poor light, was unmistakable. One of Garrett's men, throat cut with surgical precision. It's a trap. The words left Céline's mouth the same instant arrows began raining through the broken windows. She heard rather than saw the young guard beside her grunt and fall, an arrow protruding from his shoulder. Roderick grabbed her arm, yanking her behind one of the mill's massive support beams, as more arrows whistled through the air where they'd been standing. "Werner!" Roderick's shout was answered by the sound of steel meeting steel from somewhere behind the mill. The trap had been sprung on both groups. Simultaneously, whoever had laid it understanding exactly how Roderick would approach the building. "We need to get to the cellar." Celine's voice remained steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. Marta said northwest corner, under the floorboards. "If the documents are still there, we can't let them be destroyed. If we move from this position, we're dead." Roderick's pragmatism warred with the same urgency she felt. "Those arrows are coming from at least 3 different angles. The moment we step into the open." His words cut off as fire bloomed in the mill's opposite corner. Not an accident. Not natural. Someone had thrown a torch through one of the upper windows, and the dry wood caught immediately, flames racing up the walls with terrifying speed. Smoke began filling the space, thick and choking, and Celine realized with horror that this was the plan. Pin them inside, burn the building down around them, destroy both the princess and whatever evidence might prove her identity. Now we move. Roderick pulled her toward where she'd indicated the cellar entrance should be, keeping the support beam between them and the windows. The wounded guard stumbled after them, clutching his shoulder but still managing to keep his sword raised. They found the trapdoor exactly where Marta had suggested, but it was padlocked, and the key around Celine's neck suddenly felt like a death sentence. How long would it take to unlock? Would they have that long before the flames, or the arrows, or whoever was outside found them? Her hands shook as she pulled the key free, nearly dropping it in her haste. The lock resisted, rust and age making it stubborn, and all around them the fire grew louder, hungrier, consuming everything in its path. Smoke burned her eyes, made breathing an exercise in agony. Behind her, she heard Roderick coughing, heard the wounded guard collapse to his knees. "Please!" She didn't know who she was praying to, what God might listen to someone whose entire life had been stolen. "Please, please, please." The lock clicked open. Roderick wrenched the trap door up, revealing stairs descending into deeper darkness. "Go. I'll cover you. Not without you." Celine's refusal was absolute. "We go together or not at all." For a moment, she thought he might argue, might try to sacrifice himself in some misguided act of atonement for failures 2 decades old. But then his expression shifted, something like respect flickering in his eyes, and he nodded. "Together then. Werner," he shouted toward where the sounds of combat still raged. "Fall back to the mill. We have another way out." Whether Werner heard him or could comply, Celine didn't know. Roderick was already pushing her toward the stairs, helping the wounded guard down ahead of them. She descended into darkness that felt somehow safer than the firelit chaos above, her feet finding each step through pure instinct. Behind her, Roderick followed, pulling the trapdoor shut just as a burning beam crashed down where they'd been standing. The cellar was small, cramped, with a ceiling so low Roderick had to duck. But it was stone, blessedly fireproof, and the smoke from above filtered down slowly enough that they could breathe. Celine's eyes adjusted to the darkness, picking out details. Broken barrels, cobwebs thick as curtains, and in the northwest corner, exactly as Marta had promised, floorboards that looked slightly newer than the others. She fell to her knees, fingers scrabbling at the wood. The boards came up easier than expected, revealing a hollow space beneath. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had kept them dry despite years in this damp place, were papers. Dozens of them. Letters, official documents with wax seals, and something else that made Celine's breath catch. A silver bracelet, small enough for a child's wrist, engraved with words she could barely make out in the darkness. But she didn't need to see them clearly. Her fingers traced the engraving, and memory slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. Her father's voice, warm and proud. "For my little star who lights up every room she enters." Her mother's laugh, bright as bells. "She'll treasure it forever, Edmund." Her own small voice, fierce with childhood certainty. "I'll never take it off." Never ever. The memories cascaded through her, no longer fragments, but fully formed moments. Birthdays and bedtime stories, riding lessons and tea parties with dolls. Her father teaching her to read using ancient texts about their kingdom's history. Her mother braiding her hair while singing songs in the old language. And underneath it all, the absolute certainty of being loved, of being precious, of mattering to people who would move mountains to keep her safe. Then the darkness, the raid, the terror, and finally, understanding why she'd forgotten. Not fever, not accident. Someone had systematically poisoned her, fed her compounds designed to erase her memories, to transform a princess into a ghost who could never threaten their plans. Céline? Roderick's voice pulled her back from the past. What did you find? She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, the bracelet clutched in one hand and Marta's documents in the other. Above them, the mill groaned and shuddered, dying by degrees in the fire that consumed it. Outside, she could hear shouting, the clash of weapons, the sounds of people fighting and dying over secrets that had poisoned 2 kingdoms for 20 years. Everything. Her voice emerged broken, transformed. I found everything. And now I remember who I was, who I am, and exactly who took it all away. The ceiling above them creaked ominously, and Roderick's eyes widened with alarm. We need to move. This whole structure is coming down. But as they turned toward the stairs, toward escape and whatever waited beyond this burning tomb, a new sound reached them. Footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, belonging to someone who wasn't. Fleeing but hunting. And a voice, cultured and cold, that made Céline's blood turn to ice. I do hope you found what you were looking for, dear niece. It would be a shame for you to die without knowing exactly why you had to disappear. Lord Garrett Thorne descended the cellar stairs with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed victory was already his. The firelight from above cast his shadow long and monstrous against the stone walls, and Céline found herself unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but stare at the face that her newly awakened memories recognized with visceral clarity. This was her father's brother, the man who'd bounced her on his knee at festival gatherings, who'd presented her with a wooden rocking horse on her 3rd birthday, who'd smiled at her with warmth that now revealed itself as the mask it had always been. He looked older than her fragmented recollections suggested, his hair more silver than dark, lines carved deep around his mouth. And eyes. But those eyes remained unchanged, pale blue and calculating, holding the same cold intelligence that had allowed him to orchestrate the destruction of a child and sleep soundly for 20 years afterward. Uncle. The word tasted like poison on Céline's tongue, but she forced it out anyway, watching his expression shift minutely at her recognition. Or should I call you by your proper title? Usurper, murderer of children. Which do you prefer? Garrett's lips curved into something that might have been a smile on someone capable of genuine emotion. So you do remember. How inconvenient. I'd hoped the treatments had been more permanent, but the physicians always warned me that memory suppression was an inexact science. Too much poison and you'd die. Too little and the memories might resurface. He reached the bottom of the stairs, his hand resting casually on the pommel of his sword. Still, 20 years is a respectable run. Most of the kingdom has forgotten you ever existed. Your father certainly stopped looking. That's a lie. Roderick's voice cut sharp as a blade through the smoke-thickened air. He'd positioned himself between Céline and Garrett, his own sword drawn and ready. Edmund never stopped searching. He spent a fortune on investigators, offered rewards that could buy kingdoms, interrogated every witness to the raid until his voice went hoarse, and found nothing. Garrett's smile widened, showing teeth. Because I made certain there was nothing to find. The servants who might have talked met unfortunate accidents. The guards who'd seen too much disappeared into the dungeons beneath my estate, where screams don't carry and bodies decompose slowly. Even the physicians who administered Céline's treatments believed they were helping an orphaned girl recover from trauma, never suspecting her true identity. He took another step forward, and Celine noticed for the first time that he wasn't alone. Behind him, partially obscured by smoke and shadow, stood at least 3 more armed men. I've spent 2 decades building a web so intricate, so perfect, that even when the spider sat at its center, no one could see the threads. Then why reveal yourself now? Celine forced her voice to remain steady, despite the terror that threatened to choke her. Why not let your men finish what they started? You could have stayed in Valcrest, maintained your plausible deniability, let others take the blame for my death. Something flickered across Garrett's face, there and gone too quickly to name. Pride, perhaps, or the particular vanity of a man who'd committed the perfect crime and couldn't resist boasting about it. Because I wanted you to understand. Before you die, truly die this time, I wanted you to know that this wasn't personal. I bear you no ill will, Celine. You were simply an obstacle to the natural order of things. Valcrest needs strong leadership, male leadership, not a girl child who would have been married off to whatever foreign. Prince offered the best alliance. My son Marcus, he was born to rule. Raised for it, trained for it, molded into exactly what the kingdom needs. So you murdered your brother's daughter to give your son a crown. Roderick's words dripped with contempt. And you have the audacity to claim this wasn't personal. Edmund was weak. He let sentiment cloud his judgment, let emotions dictate policy. Under his rule, Valcrest has stagnated while Ashenmore flourished. Garrett's attention shifted fully to Roderick, and Celine realized with creeping horror that this confrontation had been inevitable, that whatever happened in this cellar had been building for 20 years. You think I don't know about your guilt? How you've tortured yourself over that intercepted letter, believing yourself responsible for Celine's disappearance? That letter was the gift that kept giving, Roderick. It gave me the opportunity I needed, and it gave you a wound that never healed. 2 kingdoms weakened by one simple act. The wounded guard beside Celine made a sound, half groan, half warning. She glanced at him and saw his eyes fixed on something behind them, in the deeper shadows of the cellar. Her heart lurched as she understood. They weren't trapped between Garrett and the burning mill above. They were surrounded, caught in a kill box with no escape. But even as despair threatened to swallow her, Celine's fingers tightened around the documents she still clutched. Marta had died to protect these papers. Werner and his men were fighting somewhere above for her survival, and Roderick stood ready to sacrifice himself for sins that had never been his to bear. She would not let their efforts be meaningless. She would not become a ghost again, erased by a man who valued power over everything. You're right about one thing. Celine's voice emerged stronger now, fed by rage that burned hotter than the flames consuming the mill above. This web you built, it is intricate, impressive even, but you made one critical mistake, Uncle. You assumed that erasing my memories would erase who I am, that taking away my past would make me nobody. She stepped around Roderick despite his attempt to stop her, moving closer to Garrett with deliberate purpose. But I survived your poison. I survived the camps. I survived assassination attempts and betrayal and 20 years of being treated like I was less than human. And every single day I survived made me stronger, harder, more dangerous than any pampered princess raised in a palace could ever be. Garrett's expression shifted, amusement fading into something warier. Brave words from a girl holding papers in one hand and a child's bracelet in the other. What do you think you're going to do? Fight your way past trained soldiers with righteous anger? No. Celine's smile was sharp enough to cut. I'm going to do something much worse. I'm going to tell your son the truth. The words hit Garrett like a physical blow. His careful composure cracked, revealing the fear beneath. Marcus knows nothing about any of this. He believes, as everyone believes, that you died in the raid, that his ascension to the throne is legitimate, earned through lineage and capability. But it's not, is it? Celine pressed the advantage, watching her uncle's facade crumble with savage satisfaction. Marcus is a good man by all accounts. Honorable, just, beloved by the people. The kind of man who would be horrified to learn his entire life is built on the murder of a child, on systematic lies and manipulation orchestrated by his own father. She held up the documents, and even in the poor light, the official seals were visible. These papers prove everything. Your correspondence with the raiders, payment records, testimonies from servants you thought you'd silenced permanently. Marta was thorough. She documented your crimes with the precision of someone who knew exactly how dangerous that information was. It doesn't matter. Garrett's voice had gone. Cold, flat. You'll never leave the cellar alive to show anyone those papers. Neither will your king or his guards. By dawn, this mill will be ashes and you'll be bones no one will ever identify. My web remains intact. Except it doesn't. Roderick's words cut through the tension like thunder. You think I came here unprepared? Werner isn't just fighting your men outside. He's buying time for my fastest riders to reach both kingdoms with sealed messages, to be opened only if I don't return by dawn. Letters detailing everything we discovered, everything we suspect, including the names of your collaborators in my own court. His smile was grim, victorious. Your web is already unraveling, Garrett. The only question is whether you'll die with it or live to face justice. For the first time, genuine uncertainty crossed Garrett's face. His hand tightened on his sword, and Céline saw the calculations running behind his eyes. How many of his men were still fighting? How quickly could Roderick's messages spread? What were the odds he could still contain this disaster? The cellar groaned as another section of the mill collapsed above them, sending a shower of burning debris through gaps in the ceiling. The heat was becoming unbearable. Smoke so thick that breathing felt like swallowing knives. They were running out of time, all of them, and everyone in that underground space understood that whatever happened next would determine not just their individual fates but the future of two kingdoms. Garrett made his decision. His sword cleared its sheath with serpent quickness, and he lunged forward not at Roderick but at Céline, understanding that killing her was still the priority, that without the living proof of her existence, the documents alone might be dismissed as clever forgeries. But Céline had spent 3 years in war camps, where hesitation meant death. Her body moved before conscious thought could interfere, dropping beneath Garrett's blade and rolling sideways. She heard rather than saw Roderick engage her uncle, steel meeting steel with a sound that rang through the cellar like a bell. The wounded guard staggered to his feet, positioning himself between Céline and the men emerging from the shadows, his sword wavering but determined. "The documents!" Roderick's shout barely reached her over the chaos. "Get them out of here. There has to be another exit. Old Mills always had multiple ways in and out for smuggling. Find it and run." Every instinct screamed at two. Céline to refuse, to stay and fight beside the man who'd risked everything for her. But the cold, practical part of her brain, the part forged in survival, understood he was right. The documents mattered more than any individual life, including hers. They were the only irrefutable proof of Garrett's crimes, the only chance to expose the conspiracy and prevent her uncle from simply constructing new lies. She scrambled backward, eyes scanning the cellar walls for anything that might indicate a hidden passage. The shadows made it nearly impossible to see details, but then she noticed it. A section of wall that didn't quite match the others. Stones arranged in a pattern that suggested a door sealed long ago. She threw herself at it, fingers scrabbling for purchase, and felt something shift. Not much, just enough to confirm her suspicion. Behind her, the sounds of combat filled the cellar. Men grunting with effort, blades clashing, someone screaming as steel found flesh. She couldn't look back, couldn't afford to see who was winning or losing. All she could do was push against the wall with everything she had, feeling it give incrementally, stones grinding against each other with the sound of earth moving. The wall gave way suddenly, completely, and Céline tumbled through into a tunnel so narrow she'd have to crawl. The smell hit her immediately, damp earth and stagnant water, but also fresh air. This passage led somewhere, out and away, and toward a future that suddenly seemed possible. She looked back once, just once, and saw Roderick fighting with the desperate intensity of a man who knew this might be his last stand. Their eyes met across the smoke and chaos, and in that instant something passed between them. Not words, not promises, but understanding. Whatever happened next, they'd fought together, believed in each other, and that had to be enough. Go. His shout was final, absolute. Tell the world the truth. Make his crimes matter. Selene went. The tunnel stretched endlessly before Selene, earth pressing close on all sides like a grave that hadn't quite finished burying her. She crawled through darkness so complete it had weight, had texture, had malicious intent. The documents were clutched against her chest, protected by her body even as sharp stones tore at her knees and elbows. Behind her, muffled by tons of earth and stone, she could still hear the sounds of combat, of men dying for secrets that had poisoned everything they touched. She didn't let herself think about Roderick, couldn't afford to imagine his sword faltering, Garrett's blade finding its mark, that brilliant mind going dark while she crawled to safety. Instead, she focused on breathing despite the panic that clawed at her throat, on moving forward one painful inch at a time, on surviving because too many people had already died to get her this far. The tunnel opened without warning, depositing her into a ravine so overgrown with brambles and wild vegetation that it had become invisible from above. Selene gasped for air that tasted of freedom and smoke in equal measure, her lungs burning, her entire body screaming with pain and exhaustion. Dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed obscene given the horrors of the night. She forced herself to her feet, swaying with dizziness, and looked back toward where the mill burned. The structure was nearly gone, collapsed in on itself like a dying star. Flames still licked at what remained, sending black smoke billowing into the morning air. And around it, scattered across the clearing like discarded toys, lay bodies. She was too far away to identify them, but her heart counted them anyway, each corpse a weight added to the crushing burden of guilt and grief she carried. Movement near the mill's ruins caught her attention. Someone emerging from the wreckage, staggering, injured, but alive. Even at this distance, she recognized the figure's bearing, the way he held himself despite obvious pain. Roderick. Relief flooded through her with such intensity that her legs nearly gave out. He'd survived. Somehow, impossibly, he'd survived. But so had others. She watched as more figures appeared, some helping the wounded, others searching through debris. From this vantage point, she couldn't tell ally from enemy, couldn't determine whether Roderick was being rescued or captured. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to run now while she still could, to get the documents to someone trustworthy and let the truth do what swords and valor had failed to accomplish. Her feet refused to move. Selene stood frozen in the ravine, torn between survival instinct and something deeper, more dangerous. Roderick had saved her, protected her, fought for her when he owed her nothing beyond his own guilty conscience. Could she really abandon him now? Could she live with herself if she ran while he faced whatever came next alone? The decision was made for her when riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the mill. Dozens of them, bearing standards she recognized even from a distance. Valcrest banners, the silver stag on blue field that had represented her kingdom since before she was born. And at their head, mounted on a gray destrier that looked carved from storm clouds, sat a man whose bearing spoke of authority so absolute it needed no crown to announce itself. King Edmund. Her father. The world tilted violently. Selene's vision tunneled, her breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. That was him. The man whose face she'd forgotten, whose voice had been stolen from her, whose love had been the bedrock of her earliest memories before they'd been systematically destroyed. And he was here now, drawn by what? Roderick's messages, reports of the fire, or something deeper, some instinct that told him his daughter was close after 20 years of grieving. She watched as Edmund dismounted, as his men surrounded the mill's ruins, as he strode toward Roderick with purpose that suggested he knew exactly who he'd find here. The two kings met in the clearing, and even from her distant position, Selene could see the tension in every line of their bodies. Words were exchanged, heated on Edmund's side, placating on Roderick's. And then Roderick pointed, not toward where Selene hid, but toward the mill's collapsed cellar, toward something the flames had revealed. Guards descended into the ruins, emerging moments later carrying something between them. Not something. Someone. A body, charred and broken, but wearing armor ornate enough to identify even in its ruined state. Garrett. Her uncle had not escaped the fire, had not slipped away to rebuild his conspiracy from the shadows. Whatever justice awaited him now would be delivered by powers beyond mortal reach. Celine felt nothing looking at his corpse. No satisfaction, no grief, not even relief. Just a vast emptiness where perhaps vindication should have lived. The man who'd stolen her childhood, who'd poisoned her mind and body, who'd murdered innocents to protect his son's claim to power, was dead. And his death changed nothing about the years she'd lost, the person she might have been if he'd let her live. More riders appeared, these bearing Ashenmoor's crimson and gold. Werner at their head, bloodied but triumphant, leading prisoners whose hands were bound. Celine recognized some of them from the fighting, Garrett's personal guard and others, who'd been part of the conspiracy. The web Roderick had spoken of was indeed unraveling, its threads being cut one by one until nothing remained but the truth, naked and terrible in the morning light. Edmund's attention shifted from Garrett's body to Roderick, and even from a distance, Celine could read the question in her father's posture. Where is she? You said my daughter lives. Where is she? Roderick turned, his gaze sweeping across the landscape until it found her. Their eyes met across the distance, and something passed between them that needed no words. A question, a choice. He could point her out, bring this to its conclusion, reunite father and daughter in a moment that would reshape two kingdoms. Or he could lie, give her more time, let her decide when and how to reveal herself. His hand rose, pointing not at her hiding place, but at the tunnel entrance she'd emerged from. Speaking words she couldn't hear but could imagine. She escaped. Through there. I don't know where she went. Edmund moved with speed that belied his age, guards scrambling to follow as he strode toward the tunnel. And Celine understood that she had perhaps 5 minutes, maybe less, before they found her. 5 minutes to decide whether she was ready to stop being a ghost and become a princess again. 5 minutes to choose between the life she'd been forced to live and the one that had been stolen. She looked down at the documents still clutched in her arms, at the bracelet on her wrist that she'd slipped on while crawling through darkness. Evidence of who she'd been, proof of crimes committed against her, symbols of a legacy she hadn't asked for but couldn't deny. And she thought about Marta, dying to protect these secrets, about Werner and his men, fighting against impossible odds, about Roderick, carrying guilt for 20 years over a crime that was never his. They'd all sacrificed so much to bring her to this moment. Could she honor that sacrifice by running? Or did she owe them? Herself, the courage to step into the light and claim what had been taken? Celine climbed out of the ravine. Each step toward the clearing felt like walking through water, resistance building with every movement forward. Her legs shook, her hands trembled, her heart hammered against her ribs with such force she thought it might shatter them. She was filthy, bleeding, dressed in clothes torn beyond recognition. She looked nothing like a princess, nothing like the daughter of kings. She looked like exactly what she was, a survivor, marked by horrors that would never fully heal. Edmund had reached the tunnel entrance when she called out, her voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength. Father? The single word stopped him mid-stride. He turned slowly, as though afraid that movement might shatter whatever magic had produced that sound. His eyes found her, and Celine watched as his face transformed through a dozen emotions in the space of a heartbeat. Disbelief, hope, recognition, and finally, devastation so complete it made her own heart crack in sympathy. Celine? Her name emerged from his lips like a prayer, like a question, like a confession of every failure and broken promise. My little star? The nickname shattered whatever composure she'd maintained. Tears streamed down her face as memories crashed over her in waves. Him calling her that while tucking her into bed. Him singing songs about stars and constellations, promising she'd always shine bright. Enough to find her way home. Him holding her after nightmares, whispering that no darkness could touch her while he kept watch. She walked toward him, and he toward her, until they met in the middle of the clearing with all the armies and witnesses and weight of 2 kingdoms bearing down on them. Up close, she could see how the years had marked him. Gray hair where dark had been, lines carved deep by grief, eyes that had seen too much suffering. But underneath the damage, she recognized him. Knew him. This was the face her child self had adored, the voice her stolen memories had refused to completely erase. "I thought you were dead." Edmund's voice broke on the words. 20 years I thought you were dead. I mourned you, raged for you, would have burned the world to ash if I'd thought it would bring you back. His hands reached toward her, stopping just short of touching as though afraid she might evaporate. "What did they do to you? Where have you been?" "Surviving." The word encompassed everything, explained nothing. "Uncle Garrett made certain I forgot who I was, where I came from, everyone who might have looked for me. He turned me into a ghost so thoroughly that even I believed I was nobody." She held out the documents, and it cost her everything to release them into his shaking hands. But Marta kept the proof, and Roderick found me, and here we are. Edmund's eyes scanned the papers, his face going from anguish to furious as he read evidence of his brother's betrayal. When he looked up, there were tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Garrett did this. My own brother tried to murder my daughter so his son could take the throne. He succeeded in stealing 20 years from us." Celine's voice remained steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "But he failed at erasing me completely. I survived. I'm here. And I remember enough to know that I was loved, once, that I mattered to someone beyond whatever political value my existence represented." Edmund closed the distance between them in 2 strides, pulling her into an embrace that was desperate, protective, devastating in its intensity. Celine felt his body shake with sobs he could no longer contain, felt her own tears soaking into his travel-stained shirt. They stood like that while the sun climbed higher, while armies waited, while history held its breath to see what would happen next. "I'm sorry." Edmund's words emerged muffled against her hair. "I'm so sorry I didn't protect you. Sorry I didn't look harder, search longer, refuse to believe you were gone. Sorry for every day you spent alone thinking no one cared, no one remembered, no one loved you enough to keep fighting. You couldn't have known." The absolution came easier than she'd expected. Garrett was careful, thorough. He used your trust against you, used love as a weapon. But it's over now. He's dead, his conspiracy exposed. What matters is what we do next. Edmund pulled back enough to study her face, his hands cupping her cheeks with infinite gentleness. "What do you want? Truly, because you're the heir, Celine, the legitimate heir to Valcrest's throne. Everything I've built, everything I've preserved, it's yours by right. But if you want something else, if you want to walk away from crowns and politics and the weight of kingdoms, I'll support that choice. You've earned the right to choose your own path." The question hung between them, profound in its implications, and Celine realized that for the first time in 20 years, perhaps for the first time in her life, someone was offering her genuine choice. Not commands disguised as options, not manipulation dressed as concern, but real freedom to determine her own future. She looked past her father to where Roderick stood with his own men, watching this reunion with an expression that mingled relief and something that looked almost like loss. Their eyes met, and she understood what he wasn't saying. That if she accepted her birthright, if she became the princess she was born to be, whatever had begun to grow between them in the crucible of shared danger would have to end. Princesses didn't fall for foreign kings, especially not ones whose kingdoms had been at war. Politics would demand different alliances, strategic marriages, sacrifices for the greater good. But she also understood that she'd spent 20 years being nobody, having no voice, no power, no ability to change anything about the world that had chewed her up and spit her out. If she walked away now, If she chose a quiet life free from royal obligations, men like Garrett would continue to operate in the shadows. Innocent people would continue to suffer while the powerful played their games. And all the sacrifice, all the blood spilled to bring her to this moment would be meaningless. I want justice. Her voice emerged clear, strong, transformed by decision into something approaching command. Not just for me, but for everyone Garrett harmed. The servants he murdered, the physicians he manipulated, the girl I might have been if he'd let me live. I want his accomplices tried and punished. I want his crimes exposed so thoroughly that no one can ever attempt something like this again. She paused, then added the words that would reshape everything. And I want to learn how to be the princess I was meant to become, not the ghost he tried to make me. Edmund's face transformed, pride and grief and hope mingling into something that looked almost like peace. Then we'll do it together, father and daughter, king and heir. We'll rebuild what was broken and make certain it never breaks again. The armies erupted in cheers, soldiers on both sides celebrating an ending that felt more like a beginning. Céline let the sound wash over her, let herself be swept into embraces from strangers who claimed her as their princess, their future, their hope. But even in the midst of chaos and celebration, her eyes found Roderick one last time. He bowed, formal and distant, acknowledging her not as the girl he'd saved, but as the royal she was becoming. And in that gesture, they both understood that whatever might have been between them was already fading, already becoming the story they'd tell themselves late at night when the weight of crowns grew too heavy and memories of simpler dangers brought unexpected comfort. Some prices were too high, some sacrifices too complete. But as Céline stood surrounded by her father's army, wearing a child's bracelet and carrying documents stained with blood and truth, she understood that she'd finally reclaimed the most important thing Garrett had tried to steal. Her name, her past, her future, herself. The lost princess had come home, and the kingdoms that had been broken by her absence would now have to learn what it meant to be healed by her return. Sometimes the cruelest theft isn't what's taken from your hands, but what's stolen from your mind. Céline lost 20 years, an entire childhood, the warmth of a father's love, all erased by poison and lies. But she survived. She clawed her way back from the void they'd tried to trap her in, and reclaimed not just her name, but her right to choose who she would become. Ask yourself, if everything you knew about yourself turned out to be a carefully constructed lie, if the people who should have protected you were the ones who tried to destroy you, would you have the strength to face that truth? Would you choose the crown that was stolen, or the freedom you fought so hard to earn? This story reminds us that identity isn't just about the past we remember, but about the choices we make when confronted with who we really are. Marta spent 2 decades drowning in guilt for one mistake. Roderick carried the weight of a crime that was never his, and Céline, she had to decide whether being a princess mattered more than simply being alive. In the end, justice demanded sacrifice, love required distance, and healing meant accepting that some wounds never fully close. They just teach us how to carry the scars with dignity. If this story moved you, if it made you question what you'd do when faced with impossible choices, then share it with someone who needs to hear that survival is its own form of victory. Hit that like button if you believe the truth, no matter how painful, is always worth fighting for. And subscribe, because stories like these, stories that challenge us to be braver than we think we can be, are what we're here to tell. Until next time, remember that who you are isn't defined by what was taken from you, but by what you refuse to let them steal.